Some news just in. A spokesman for the Prince of Wales has said that arrangements are in progress for the Prince of Wales to go to Paris. She could not confirm when that might be. Now let's go to our political editor, Michael Brunson, who's in the Sedgefield constituency of the Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Tony Blair has been week-ending there. You're outside the church, I believe, that Mr Blair attends, Mike.
That is right. Mr Blair will be coming here in about a quarter of an hour. He has come up to his constituency. He had a political meeting yesterday and he is in his home just a couple of miles or so away, and he will come here and he will make a statement. He was woken up at about 2 o'clock this morning with the news. He then apparently tried to get back to sleep, but I suspect, like anyone who's heard that kind of news, he was unable to. He then began work with his press secretary, Alistair Campbell, who is in London, by telephone, working on the statement that he issued. You've already heard about that statement, but you will know that it says in there, Diana was a wonderful, warm and compassionate person whom people not just in Britain but throughout the world loved, and that she will be mourned as a friend. Now, Mr Blair will say much the same thing when he comes here, but he will make some other points as well. What I gather he wants to say is that he thinks that Princess Diana was a real asset to Britain. And in fact, he had had a meeting with her quite recently. There'd been a lunch at Chequers, to which Princess Diana and one of the young princes came, and that was an opportunity for the Prime Minister and Diana to talk things through. And of course, they had begun to come quite close over this whole business of landmines. As you know, one of the first things that the government did was to announce the ban on landmines, and so they were talking generally about how things could be taken forward and how Diana's role could fit into all that. Now, as to what will happen later today, Mr Blair will attend this service. I gather that he will be reading one of the lessons. He will then go back to his home. He will then go back to Chequers. But of course, very much in his mind and everybody else's mind are the arrangements, not just for the funeral, but the arrangements for political life herein. And I understand that it is most likely that there will be a suspension of campaigning for the Scottish and Welsh referendums. As you know, we're in almost an election situation at the moment, and I understand that there will probably be an agreement among the political leaders that as a mark of respect to Princess Diana, the campaigning in those elections should be suspended.
Mike, a suspension of campaigning, but the polls still go ahead on the dates arranged.
Yes, at this stage there is no suggestion that the polls will be cancelled, but I think that there is the feeling that life just can't go on quite as normal. Quite obviously not for all of us, it can't go on as normal, and so as a mark of respect, it has happened before when these things have happened, campaigning will be suspended. But as I say, what the Prime Minister wants to get across is that he thinks that Diana, in a sense, through her youth still, was very much in tune with what the government was trying to make the sense of Britain at the moment, that it was, if you like, there was a fresh start abroad, that there was a sort of youthful feeling about so much, and that he thinks that Princess Diana chimed with that despite all the difficulties of the marriage, all the difficulties that she'd had, all the difficulties indeed with her relations with the press, that she was an asset to Britain, that was someone who could do very great things for Britain, and he was very, very much behind her in that kind of work, and particularly in the campaign on landmines.
There were, of course, those comments attributed to the Princess very recently, ironically, in the French press, which were very supportive of the current government.
Yes, indeed. She had, as it were, put a fairly substantial toe into the whole political arena. And when that news broke, there was no sense at all from members of the government that they wanted to criticise her for what she was saying. At the time, one or two people said privately, they didn't want to gloat, but they said privately, well, you know, we're hardly going to criticise the Princess if she feels that this government represents her kind of views and the last government didn't. And so while there was no, if you like, great song and dance about it at the time, there was a feeling that, yes, the Princess and the government were, if you like, on the same wavelength.
Mike, thank you very much indeed. A reminder that we've broken into the regular schedules for this special programme on Diana, Princess of Wales, who was killed in a car crash in Paris early this morning. She and her friend Dodi Fayed were being pursued by photographers on motorbikes when their car crashed into a tunnel alongside the River Seine shortly after midnight. Surgeons at a Paris hospital tried to stem internal bleeding in her chest but couldn't restart her heart. They declared her dead at 3 a.m. British time. Dodi Fayed died at the scene. Well, in the studio with me is Ronald Allison, a former press secretary to the Queen. Ronald Allison, maybe too early yet to try and assess the Princess's contribution to life, but she had so much potential, yet so many achievements.
Yes, it is too early, as you say, but even at this point, and we've just been picking up from Mike Brunson some of the thoughts that the Prime Minister has already expressed and will subsequently be expressing. Tragedy, tragic, everything about it, that word sums it up. Just one of the particular points that makes it so tragic and so poignant, to me anyway, is that after the turmoils of the marriage and the divorce and all the rest of it, the Princess did seem to me to be establishing a role for herself. When she referred to herself as Queen of Hearts or Queen of the Hearts in the Panorama interview, one wondered a bit. But in the way that she was continuing her support for Great Ormond Street Hospital, for the victims of AIDS, for those who are HIV positive, and then latterly the campaign to get landmines banned worldwide, you could see a developing role. And it wasn't a role based on wishful thinking, because she could make a difference. She did command attention, as we know. But she was a powerful ally to have to any cause that you cared about. And for so many reasons, that the ending of her life in this way is a tragedy. But in terms of this particular aspect, it's particularly tragic. Maybe the work will somehow or other be strengthened by this.
I'm sure. We talked earlier about the Princess's almost naivety just before she married Charles vis-à-vis the press. As she matured, she learned how to channel that attention and use it as she saw it in very positive ways.
Well, there's a sense, I think, in which, as far as the press are concerned, she tried to have it both ways. Indeed, she was able to utilise the press. They were on her side over so many of the causes. But what she had to accept in the way that things are in this day and age, in this world in which we now are, that they didn't stop when she wanted them to stop. You couldn't shut the door on them and say, fine, now we've dealt with landmines, we've dealt with my causes, we've dealt with the lighthouse, we've dealt with Great Ormond Street, whatever it may be. It went on and on and on, and that was where she was finding it extremely difficult to come to terms with the relentless and intense attention.
OK, Ronald Allison, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's cross now to the Princess of Wales' London home, Kensington Palace. Helen Wright is there. Helen, I can see quite a crowd gathering behind you there. What is the mood?
The mood is a very sombre one. As you say, there are people at the gates of Kensington Palace behind me. There's been a steady stream of people arriving here since very early this morning, bringing flowers, some lighting candles. Others have just stood at the gates in total silence, just looking at the palace, some comforting each other. One woman sat on the ground and prayed just outside the gates of the palace. One man was very overcome. He sat down and he wept very openly. Everybody here is just very shocked. There have been tourists arriving at the palace just to look round, as they would on any day of their holiday, and the news has been broken to them as they've arrived. Everybody obviously very upset at this tragic event.
Helen, I've been talking to Tim Ewart outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, and he's reported some hostility to the press and photographers there. Is that happening at Kensington Palace?
It is. Earlier on, a bus driver who was going past here stopped his bus and shouted at photographers, "I hope you're satisfied." One man I saw who brought flowers pushed his way through the press here and said, "I hope you're happy now." But those are just sort of isolated incidents. In the main, people are just here to express their sadness. They're not really judging the sort of circumstances of the accident. They're just trying to come to terms with what's happened.
Helen Wright at Kensington Palace, thank you very much indeed. Well, Nicholas Owen, our royal correspondent, is with me in the studio now. Let's just try and pull the strands of this together. Enormous, enormous shock. reverberating around the world now.
Yeah, enormous shock, obviously, and you know, practical things to worry about at the same time. The matter of what will happen with the princess, some suggestion that her body may come back to Britain later today, and then the funeral, what would happen to that? I mean, some people might say it's all too early to think of that, but of course events will begin to take over. And what seems to be happening is that, as all senior members of the royal family, she is entitled, if that is the right way of putting it, to lie eventually at rest at St George's Chapel at Windsor. And I think that unless she'd expressed a personal preference for somewhere else, that's probably what will happen. A funeral service, I would guess, at Westminster Abbey in London, and then interment at Windsor, and probably, well, maybe the end of the week, maybe the beginning of next week. But I have to say, you know, the impact all the way around, the royal family, for example, I was talking to somebody has been very, very close indeed to the Queen, and I said, well, you know, what was Her Majesty's attitude to the Princess? And she said, well, with the Princess of Wales, life was always dramatic. I think this is what the view inside the palace was, you know. The Queen was tolerant as she could be. I don't deny there was a note of impatience now and then, this person said, but the Queen's door was always open. She always tried to be helpful. And I think there was a sort of feeling in the palace, much as there is the country at large, that, you know, some of the things the princess did, I mean, I found this when I was following the princess around the world, attending things with her and covering her as a journalist, that there were some occasions when the things she did sort of infuriated you almost. I admit it, there were days when all seemed terribly mad, and then there were other times, the majority of times, when the sheer goodness of what she did, the sheer power of her personality, the way she could change things, that also came home to you very, very forcibly indeed. And I think this country and this whole world is a great deal poorer this morning.
OK, Nick, thank you very much. Well, I'm joined now by the writer and royal biographer, Hugo Vickers. Mr Vickers, what will be the reaction amongst the princess's staff? As we were hearing there from Nicholas, she was tremendously loved by everyone who worked for her.
Oh, I think anyone who came into contact with her will feel it extremely strongly. I mean, the general public who only perhaps just saw her passing by are feeling it strongly. So anyone who has worked with her are going to be extremely upset, because she was a very memorable personality. I mean, you know, the few times that I met her over a period of 15, 16 years, I remember so clearly every different time. And she did have a remarkable aura about her. I mean, she was, not only did she sort of transform herself from this girl from a good English family who was a kindergarten teacher, she suddenly became a princess, but then she became more than that, really. She really became a world star. I mean, she will be an icon. I mean, she's comparable to people like Princess Grace of Monaco, who did so much in Monaco, and it's because, fundamentally, I think everything, all her success and her, possibly, if you like, her occasional failings, all came from the fact that she had a good heart.
Well, Hugo Vickers, thank you very much indeed. Stay with us. We are joined now on the phone by the royal biographer, Penny Junor. Penny Junor, comes as a shock, obviously. When did you hear the news?
I heard at 5 o'clock this morning. When you phoned me, in fact.
And
it came
how would you assess the princess's life?
Well, I think I think she's had the most extraordinary effect on not just the British public, but on the international world. I think she put the royal family on a footing which really it had not had in recent times. I mean, she was a fantastic ambassador for both the royal family and for Britain, I think, across the world, and much loved.
There are, of course, going to be questions about the circumstances surrounding her death. The Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook, has said that there has to be a serious look into the aggressive intrusion into her privacy. She was almost besieged by the press, wasn't she?
Yes, I think she was, but I think that, I think it was a mixed blessing for her. I think she actually had found them less irritating than perhaps we would think. I think she used the press to her advantage on many occasions. And I mean, after all, it was the press that shot her to superstardom, and I think she enjoyed that status. And I think she would have been very miserable had the press left her alone.
The Prince of Wales, no doubt enormously shocked. You, of course, have been a friend of the Prince written about him.
Well, I've written
Have you
about
had any reaction from that quarter?
I haven't. I mean, I have no doubt that he will be absolutely devastated. And of course, her children, yet again, are the people who are the real victims in this whole tragedy. I mean, they have suffered immeasurably from the breakup of the marriage, I have no doubt. And here they are yet again. And, you know, I mean, everyone's heart, I think, just goes out to the whole lot of them. I think the prince and his children.
They were, of course, enormously close, the princess and her children. Is it possible to assess the impact on William and Harry?
Well, I think it will just be devastating. I just hope that they don't blame the press forevermore. I mean, clearly this accident happened because she was being chased, but I do understand that that is very much the norm in France, that the paparazzi do chase personalities when they see them getting into cars and shooting off. So, I mean, I would be very sorry if the boys were left with this kind of a bitter feeling about it. I mean, it is ghastly. It's a tragedy, but I hope that they will recognise how much their mother was loved and come out of it with some positive thoughts and not just negative about the press, as I say.
Penny Junior, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's go back now to Hugo Vickers, the royal biographer. Mr. Vickers, looking at Diana's life, it could be said that sadness dogged her from a very early age from her parents' divorce.
Yes, I think it will be seen as a very sad life. I hope not too sad, because there were moments of... She certainly gave us all a lot of happiness for many years, and I think it would be a pity, but there obviously were. I mean, she had a pretty rotten childhood, and then she had huge disappointments when she realised that her marriage wasn't going to work out. She said she wanted to be a good wife, and that was a terrible thing. But
it did seem in the past few months that the clouds were lifting. She was in a relationship she clearly enjoyed, and of course her charity work was going well, her work on landmines.
Yes, but at the same time, of course, she was always being dogged by controversy. I mean, the landmine question, I think, is particularly interesting. I mean, I always believed that it is her duty, really, to go out and when she sees something that's awful that is happening, to come back and tell us about it. But then, of course, you see the press always wanted to make more of it. They wanted to say she's getting involved in political controversy. I don't think she was. I think she just wanted to draw people's attention to this issue and then step aside. You'll remember that she didn't go to the House of Commons Select Committee because the press began to make a fuss about that. I think she must have found that extremely frustrating, that every time that she tried to do something which was constructive and which you would have thought was not controversial, it always came back to something where it was twisted around, that she was trying to steal the headlines and this kind of thing. And that is why, as so often happens, and we heard it even from her last week, this awful feeling really that a prophet is not without honour save in his own country, that in the world, out in the world, she'd become increasingly popular, whereas in this country, I mean, things weren't going so well, which is very sad.
Hugo, we've got some recent pictures of the princess here. She had, everyone describes it, an immense aura surrounding her. Can you just talk a bit about the effect she had on people?
Well, yes, it's interesting, because I saw her for the last time, talked to her in June when she was presenting her dresses at Christie's in London. And I was a little bit worried because I hadn't seen her in the flesh for some time, and I wondered whether I was going to find this rather fragile individual that some people had been writing about. But not at all, you're quite right. She was extremely healthy, almost Californian, bronzed, very bright, just the same as ever, quick, amusing, friendly, making you feel that you were the one person she wanted to talk to.
There we see her talking to a little girl, getting the bouquet of flowers, and complete concentration, nothing false about that, is there?
Absolutely, and that was the two things that you'll find that the most successful princesses in history are ones who love children and care for the sick. Now, this is something which can't be faked, and in her case it was absolutely inherent and genuine. And of course, as far as the caring for the sick is concerned, this has already been discussed with Ron Allison, I mean, her work with very contemporary illness of HIV and AIDS was extremely important, what she did. And those were natural gifts, and for that she will always be remembered.
Hugo Vickers, for the timing, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's go back to Nicholas Owen, our royal correspondent. And we have some pictures coming in from the scene at Buckingham Palace. Let's have a look at them together, Nick.
Yes. That's the usual scene. No traffic, of course. This being a Sunday, some while ago they reorganised the road there and banned all traffic. But what we can see, if you look across the house, camera is beginning to show us, we move across the road there, a lot of people around. Now remember, the Queen and the other members of the royal family not there. They're up on their summer holiday in Balmoral, where they've learned the dreadful news. Reference to Tim Hewitt was telling us earlier, our correspondent there, talking about the number of people there who didn't really know what was going on, tourists turning up and being told the news.
They do seem to be milling around, don't they?
And I think the mood is going to be, we come back to this point and we shall hear a great deal more of it, Dermot, this idea that somehow the media in general will be getting a lot of scrutiny now. There'll be a lot of hard questions asked, a lot of resentment, anger, even fury that the princess's life should have been ended because of the activities of photographers. There you see more people up on the Queen Victoria monument there.
Sitting there motionless, almost
yes.
An air of disbelief there, isn't there?
Exactly. Normally there are people scurrying to and fro and jumping about. That looks to me, you know, there are people on the move, but it's pretty slow, and I should imagine the atmosphere there is just one of utter misery as everywhere else. It's interesting that the way people do focus on Buckingham Palace at times of national crisis, because of course it's Kensington Palace is the princess's home, a couple of miles up the road, and we've heard that there are lots of people there too laying flowers. But here we are, Buckingham Palace, focus of attention inevitably, and I think there'll be much more of that over the coming days.
Okay, Nick, thank you very much indeed. Let's cross the Atlantic now and go live to our reporter John Irvine in Washington. John, the wee small hours there, but there has been reaction, hasn't there, from the President?
Yes, the President has said that both he and his wife Hillary Clinton are very upset about the death of the Princess. They are on holiday on Martha's Vineyard, an island off New England. We're told they were attending a party tonight, and that when they were informed about the Paris crash, they embraced one another and left the function shortly afterwards. In a statement, the President said both he and his wife had been very fond of the Princess. The statement goes on, tonight our sympathy goes out to her family, her friends, and especially her children.
John, she was much loved there, wasn't she? And she loved America too.
Very much so. I think if Americans could have adopted the Princess, they would have done. America has had a long-standing love affair with her. For many people in this country, she was quite simply the most glamorous person in the world. People admired her for her work in humanitarian causes. One thinks of the fight against AIDS and more recently her campaign for a worldwide ban on landmines. Tonight, the former US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, described her as a woman who desperately wanted to make a difference in this world.
I well remember the clamour when she was at a charity do, I think it was in Chicago, I believe, where people were kind of falling over themselves to dance with her.
Very much so. I mean, one thinks also of the sale of her dresses up in New York. She chose to do that here. I think there was a belief, we looked at what happened over in Los Angeles about Dodi Fayed. He has a mansion over there. People here thought that she might possibly come and live in the United States. There was enormous sympathy for her here. There was nothing controversial about her. Americans genuinely loved the Princess.
John, thank you very much indeed. Just let me give you a reminder that we've broken into the regular schedules for this special programme on Diana, Princess of Wales, who was killed in a car crash in Paris early this morning. She and her friend Dodi Fayed were being pursued by photographers on motorbikes when their car crashed into a tunnel alongside the River Seine shortly after midnight. Surgeons at a Paris hospital tried to stem internal bleeding in her chest, but couldn't restart her heart. They declared her dead at 3 a.m. British time. Dodi Fayed died at the scene. And we are expecting to hear live from the Prime Minister shortly. Now in the studio with me all morning is Nicholas Owen, our royal correspondent. Nicholas, we're expecting to hear from the Prime Minister. I think he has summed up the nation's sense of shock.
I think he said something on the lines of, you know, this is absolutely everybody will be stunned by that, and of course he does speak absolutely for everybody there, doesn't he? I was reminded, John Irvine was talking about Chicago. We both talked about it there. I remember that very, very well indeed. That was a stunning example of the Princess's capacity to sort of captivate one of the most cynical and hard-bitten audiences in the world there. Do you remember her coming down a sweeping staircase like all the movie stars in all the world you've ever seen, you know? I mean, that was amazing. And there was talk that she wanted to live in America, but that's an interesting point, you know. When she got back, I said to one of her people, well, does she want to live in America? Oh, no. She said, no, not really. She didn't really like all that close attention, so there was always this element with the princess that things were sort of, you know, up one minute and down the next. And again, I come back, I think I said this a bit earlier, and I'll say it again. You know, it's so human, really, that. I mean, the thing about the Princess of Wales is that, yes, she had a lot of faults and a lot of delightful sides. She was like, a lot of us would perhaps like to be only magnified, if you know what I mean. And it was that sort of personality that came through, whether the grand, high and mighty, or children in Angola whose legs had been blown off by landmines. Do you know, the whole gamut of humanity managed to react to her in some way or another.
There was, of course, talk about her living in America, as you mentioned. There was talk very recently about her perhaps leaving England if she developed her relationship with Dodie Fayed. But it was above all her children that really kept her anchored in Britain, wasn't it? Because they, of course, have to be brought up.
Yes, absolutely right. But in that recent interview she gave to Le Monde, a terribly serious French newspaper, not given to sort of covering the more flippant royal stories, they gave a very serious. She gave a very serious interview to them, and she said that her sons actually were rather saying to her, "Well, mother, you really ought to go because of all this awful thing." And I think she said something on the lines of, "Any sane person would have done so." But no, she did feel very anchored. In the end, this was still the country that she wanted to be in. This is her sons are going to be at school here, and of course, you know, her son William is the heir to the throne, and that was a responsibility she took enormously seriously. I mean, it was never any suggestion at all that you know, there's anything other than the dominant part of her life, really. I mean, there was this talk, you remember, it all seemed so long ago and so silly, really, that she was somehow backing the idea that William would become the next king, you know. But and then sort of skip past Charles. Well, I don't think she felt that way at all. I think she still retained a very clear image of what the destiny for herself and the country. Oh, here is the Prime Minister.
Here, yes, he is arriving at church in his constituency in Sedgefield. Just leaving his car there. His wife Cherie behind him, the children, young Catherine, and the boys, Nicky and Ewan. Really pouring with rain there. We're expecting a statement from the Prime Minister. I don't know if he's going to say something before he goes to church or when he comes out. We are expecting him to stop and say a few brief words before he enters the church, where he is apparently going to read a sermon.
Prime Minister, can we please have your reaction to the news?
I feel like everyone else in this country today, utterly devastated. Our thoughts and prayers are with Princess Diana's family, in particular her two sons, the two boys. Our hearts go out to them. We are today a nation in Britain in a state of shock, in mourning, in grief that is so deeply painful for us. She was a wonderful and a warm human being. Though her own life was often sadly touched by tragedy, she touched the lives of so many others in Britain, throughout the world, with joy and with comfort. How many times shall we remember her, in how many different ways? With the sick, the dying, with children, with the needy. When with just a look or a gesture that spoke so much more than words, she would reveal to all of us the depth of her compassion and her humanity. You know how difficult things were for her from time to time. I'm sure we can only guess at, but the people everywhere, not just here in Britain, everywhere, they kept faith with Princess Diana. They liked her, they loved her. They regarded her as one of the people. She was the people's princess. And that's how she will stay, how she will remain in our hearts and in our memories forever.
Prime Minister, we understand there may be a suspension of campaigning in the Scottish and Welsh referendums as a mark of respect. Is that something that you'd like to happen?
Well, I'm sure that will be considered, Michael, and there are a whole lot of questions that need to be asked and answers that will be given. But just right at this moment, I don't think it's the right time. And
you yourself met her, did you not, just before she went on holiday to talk things over. Her mood then was very buoyant, in terrible contrast to what we're all thinking today.
yes, she seemed full of happiness, full of life, and she was great fun to be with, and she was an unusual but a really warm character and personality. And I will remember her personally with very great affection. I think the whole country will remember her with the deepest affection and love. And that is why our grief is so deep today. Thank you. I should say to you, I've already spoken to the Queen and the Prince of Wales.
The Prime Minister, Tony Blair, there speaking live outside his local church in his Sedgefield constituency. Nicholas Owen is with me in the studio now. Nicholas, an incredibly moving tribute there. I don't know if you saw two women actually bursting into tears behind Mr. Blair.
Well, frankly, I think Mr. Blair was close to tears, wasn't he? And I'm not surprised, because I think this is the ITN newsroom you can see behind me here, and I can tell you, Dermot will agree with me, I think, that there's been times in the last few hours when there's tears round here. I mean, the sense of shock and outrage, which the Prime Minister talked about, a nation in a state of shock, he said. He said he was utterly devastated, and our hearts go out, as we were saying earlier, particularly to the Princes William and Harry, and he said, in our hearts forever, he was talking about the Princess, and then that lovely sort of personal note when he talked about she was great fun to be with, a really warm character and personality, and I think that was, very much the way that we would all say that. There was, of course, the public and the private princess, and those of us who did have the chance to meet and talk to her, there was that side of her. It was sort of impish most of the time, I have to say, when you were relaxing, not on serious occasions, of course, but there was that wonderful way, and she was jolly acute. She would spot, the one thing that either you were interested in, or you were a bit sort of nervous of bringing up almost. You'd, I know you like XYZ, don't you? And there was this lovely way. And that wasn't a result of, deep research or stacks of people passing her pieces of paper and all this. It was just human intuition, and this was part of, and I think this was the sort of thing that we saw the Prime Minister alluding to there. That was a stunning tribute, and I think there was about 3 minutes or so of it wasn't there. And he said, too, many other questions, postponing the devolution campaign and so on. We just don't know about those things yet, do we?
OK, Nick, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's go back to Sedgefield, where Mr. Blair just made that statement. Our political editor, Michael Brunson, was there listening to every word. Mike, the Prime Minister clearly speaking from the heart.
Well, I've never seen him speak quite so solemnly. He's normally a person, as you know, with quite a sort of lilt in his voice, but this has really hit him very hard. He heard about it very soon after the first news came through at 2 a.m. in the morning. He tried apparently to go back to sleep, but he couldn't go back to sleep, and so he's been thinking about this since 2 o'clock in the morning. And as you said earlier, a very, very moving tribute. I think he really spoke for us all in a sense there when he was talking about the way that Princess Diana could have such an effect with the sick and with the children by just a touch, just a look. He particularly picked up on that. And it is very much his feeling that here was a young woman that, despite all the tragedy, had potential to do so much. He personally felt that she was an asset to the country, a very strong asset to the country, that she embodied, if you like, that feeling of youthfulness which is abroad in the country. And you could see in how the Prime Minister looked and the tone of voice that he used, that he felt this enormous sense of loss, that's gone, that's been cut away. And the long pauses and as he spoke, he was thinking, as we all are, of, my God, what a terrible tragedy.
And the relationship, of course, went beyond that between the Prime Minister and the mother of the future king. The families had got to know each other, hadn't they?
Yes, at one stage there was even a suggestion, you remember, that the Blair children might go up with them when the Prime Minister went up for the Balmoral weekend. Now, nothing came of that in the end. I gather that the invitation was extended, but that it was the Blairs who thought that perhaps that wasn't quite the way forward to go. But again, it gives you this impression of here's a young Prime Minister with a young family, and there is a young princess with the princes growing up. And I think also that we were beginning to see the development of a working relationship between Number 10 and the Prime Minister and the Princess. That had happened very much under John Major. If you remember, it was John Major who spoke to the Princess at very considerable lengths in the times leading up first to the separation from Prince Charles and then to the announcement of the divorce, terribly traumatic times, and Mr. Major had a good deal of contact with her there. And now Mr. Blair was beginning to establish that contact. As I said earlier, there'd been the luncheon at Chequers in the end of July, I think it was, with the Princess and one of the Princes, just going for a quiet occasion at Chequers, and then the Prince and the Prime Minister having a talk afterwards. And again, it's that sense, isn't it? It comes to us all that someone we've known, that we've just been speaking with, we've had dealings with, in this case in July, and then suddenly this awful news of a death in such terrible, terrible circumstances. And as I say, the Prime Minister, and as you picked up, the people here who were watching on the green at Sedgefield, the lady in tears as the Prime Minister spoke, and she was in tears afterwards. It really is hitting home very, very hard indeed.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. Well, as you might imagine, with these momentous events, probably the most momentous events of the late 20th century, there is enormous activity going on across the world. Information is coming in from all quarters, and Tim Wilcox in the ITN newsroom has been monitoring developments. Tim.
Yes, Dermot, it's not just national and international figures. Some of Diana's closest friends have been paying their own tributes as well to Diana. Rosa Monckton, who's married to Dominic Lawson, who was on holiday with the Princess just a few days ago, has spoken to the Press Association. She talks about the private side of the Princess. She said, "We've heard a lot about the Princess of Wales, the public figure, and I'd just like to say that as a friend, she was steadfast and loyal. And whenever I had any setback in my life, she was immediately there and would drop everything." She goes on poignantly to say that Diana did everything from the heart. Her heart ruled her head, which is why I think she was so often misunderstood. She was asked just before she stopped her statement about the boys, William and Harry. Harry, who is going to be 13 on the 15th of September, just a few days away. She said, "I can hardly bear to think about how they're reacting to this news." Back to you, Dermot.
Thanks very much, Tim. Well, I'm joined now by Mike Lloyd, a television cameraman who followed the Princess for many years. Mr. Lloyd, would you ever have hounded the Princess?
Not in this way, no. I think it was very bad the way they were doing the hounding over in France. I, in fact, actually gave up photography 6 months ago because it was getting harder and demands on this, and I didn't agree with actually hounding in this degree.
Was there an unofficial line over which you would not step?
Yes, there is. I mean, for instance, I was out skiing with Princess Diana, and I was up in the mountains, and we were doing pictures of her there having lunch, and she came over to me and asked me to stop filming. In fact, she put her hand over the camera, of which I said, "Fine, okay, we'll leave you alone. Sorry, I've interrupted you."
Well, we've got some of the pictures you shot yourself. Let's just bring them up here. Could you describe what exactly is going on?
Yes, this was out in St. Bart's when she went out on holiday. Sorry, this is in Spain when she went out on holiday with her friend.
I mean,
and this is at the airport.
She's clearly not happy there, is she?
No, she's not happy at all. But as you can see, I mean, we had to do the pictures if the still photographers are there, then we have to carry on doing pictures as well. But that is one occasion where it is a little bit naughty to do that. We would like to have been in one position, standing there, and just filmed her coming into the airport.
But there was almost a feeding frenzy surrounding the Princess. Frankly, there was just a lot of money to be made out of her. If you're a
there is
freelance,
for still photographers, that's correct, yes. Especially if she's with her boyfriend. But if she's on her own there, as a videographer, there isn't terribly much money in this, no.
Did you ever feel any sympathy for the Princess?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. She was hounded, but then again, she liked having a picture taken. She was forever posing for us. I mean, out in St. Bart's, we had a photo call of her in a bikini, in a beautiful red bikini. She'd let us take all these pictures. And then the next day, she won't let us take any. So we never know where we are.
Questions are, of course, going to be asked about press intrusion as a result of all this. Do you think it's time for some kind of look at privacy laws?
Certainly, yes. For riding around on motorbikes at midnight, I don't think is on. There's no value in those pictures whatsoever, really. The pictures of them kissing and cuddling, perhaps, yes, there's a value for them, but not sitting in the back of a car.
Mike Lloyd, thank you very much indeed. Well, Diana's death doesn't just rob the nation of a princess, it of course robs the two young princes, William and Harry, of a mother. They were told of her death this morning by their father, Prince Charles, at Balmoral, where they've been on holiday. Princess Diana had never made any secret of the fact that her relationship with her sons was the most important and special thing in her life. Harry Smith reports.
They are, according to those who know them, quite different characters. The two princes, pictured here at Balmoral with their father 2 weeks ago, will cope with their loss in quite different ways. The elder Prince William, who's often shown his dislike of the sort of media attention his mother has had to endure, is described as a sensitive, sometimes shy boy. At school at Eton, where he's been studying for his GCSEs, he's treated as just one of the boys, a status he's said to treasure and is keen to preserve. His school and the friendships he's made there could be a source of great strength as he tries to come to terms with his loss. His younger brother Harry is a more outgoing character. Diana was said to be less worried about his future, regarding his self-confidence and physical courage as a positive trait. He may join William at Eton, but for now he's at Ludgrove School, where staff were said today to be shocked and devastated by the news. Diana, always a picture of the devoted mother, said recently she would have left Britain if it hadn't been for her sons. Now they, who were always going to have difficult childhoods, must grow up without the support of their loving mother. Harry Smith, ITN.
Well, Nicholas Owen is with me in the studio. Nick, we saw pictures in Harry Smith's report there of the young princes at Balmoral with their father. A rather uncomfortable-looking William.
Yes, it was a strange occasion, really, because what happened, the royal officials attached to the Prince of Wales and the Queen, indeed, those who worked for them, decided that they didn't want to run any risks of this business of paparazzi creeping through bushes or anything else around Balmoral. So what they said was, for the first time, they invited the cameras in, the press and the TV cameras, and I went there myself, and I must say, on this marvellous morning on this gorgeous riverbank by Balmoral, there out came the Prince of Wales, he of course in the tartan, as he does like dressed like that, but the boy is, interesting enough, now dressed the way the princess was always keen on, much more modern, well in fact very modern, and looking reasonably relaxed. But it quickly became evident that William, we now know he's 15 years old, he's jolly tall, well over 6 foot, towers over his dad. He's not at all at ease with the whole picture-taking process. And this, after all, was not an intrusion at all. This was organised, but he had his head down like this, you know. Now, this is true of a lot of adolescents, but on the other hand, with William, it's become a real problem. And I know that at Buckingham Palace there is serious concern, has been serious concern for some while now, that, you know, how are they going to launch this young man on the public stage? And of course, they would turn round to him and say, well, now today, sir, young Prince William, you're going to meet all these photographers on the riverbank. And he'll say, but look what they did to my mother last week. So this problem was constantly feeding on itself. But there's no doubt at all that William finds the whole business of being on public display very difficult. Harry, it's a different matter altogether. Very sharp, bright young man who is, you know, happy as Larry, doesn't mind too much at all.
But clearly now that concern about William is going to be multiplied a millionfold.
Yes, of course it is. I mean, the difficulty is, you know, I mentioned earlier that I've been speaking to people involved in the court around the Queen and so on, and this has been one of their overriding concerns. You know, how are they going to deal with the situation in the future? Because William is to be king of this country, barring accidents. What a phrase to have to use on this morning, but barring accidents, he will be king one day. He can't hide away. It's just impossible. So how do they get round this problem? And it's been a terrific problem already. Now it has become an absolutely overwhelming one. And I can't help feeling that we're going to hear so much more in the next few days and weeks about that, whether there should be privacy or not. In this country, new privacy laws. But of course here we were operating abroad anyway, operating in France where the laws are different. The laws are different in America. The laws are different wherever you go. So I just think it's a matter really of all society is examining. It isn't just those who work for the press, not just the media, not just the cameramen, but the willingness of people to buy the newspapers in which the photographs appear. People go and buy. Because the princess is there, up go the sales. The man who took the photograph of the prince kissing Dodi Fayed recently, the first princess kissing Dodi Fayed recently, that made £3 million for that photographer. So, you know, there's a marketplace, there's a popular demand for these things. Everybody has to examine themselves and say, well, you know, what do we want? Do we not want these pictures? Will we refuse to buy the newspapers? It's a larger subject than just invasion of privacy, but it certainly bears very hard and very heavily on Prince William.
Thanks a lot, Nick. Well, we're joined now from Paris by our Europe correspondent, Bill Neely, who's monitoring events closely over there. Bill, what happens now?
Well, we are in fact waiting, first of all, for a statement from Buckingham Palace as to how the body of Diana, Princess of Wales, will be removed from here. Her body has been resting here for almost 8 hours now. There is a helicopter landing pad within the hospital itself, and it's thought that perhaps the Prince of Wales will arrive here by plane to the military airport outside Paris, and he will travel by helicopter to here. After that, we're not sure whether the body will leave by helicopter or by road, but it will go to that military airport where we think later today it will be taken back to Britain.
Bill, any more information about exactly what happened in that tunnel?
The details are, some are firm and some are sketchy. There clearly was a pursuit. The police have detained and have interviewed at least 4 photographers who were on what the police describe as either scooters or motorcycles. They have confiscated those, they have taken their cameras, they have developed or are developing the film, and the film on those cameras may provide some clues as well. But a few hours ago, I was actually inside the tunnel itself where the accident happened. And it's quite clear from the chalk marks that the police have made in that tunnel the sequence of events. It is one of the fastest roads along the Seine, or one of the fastest stretches of road along the River Seine in Paris. A taxi driver is reported to have told police that the car overtook his taxi at a speed of between, says the taxi driver, 140 and 160 kilometers an hour. Now that would be in and around 100 miles an hour, so very fast. The road dips and bends, and as you come into the tunnel by the Alma Bridge where the accident happens, it dips and then it curves into the tunnel. So going at a speed like that, even without pursuing motorcycles, it would be somewhat risky.
Yes,
From
Bill,
the chalk marks on the ground, it seems like it hit the curb inside the tunnel, and whether it went onto its roof or not, we don't know, but it certainly went up into the air and then hit the wall on the other side very violently. You can see scrape marks all along the wall, and all around the tunnel there are pieces of glass, bits of the car, small bits. They've taken most of the rest away. And of course the other awful remains of tragedy, the medical gloves and bits of bandages and so on. That tunnel has now been closed off to the public.
Bill, we were hearing earlier from an expert in car safety who said that the Mercedes, the S-Class Mercedes that they were driving in was one of the safest cars in the world, but presumably driving at the kind of speed you described, no car could have sustained such an impact.
Yes, as we understand it, the car was fitted with airbags, at least one of which and probably both of which deployed. The car was being driven by a security officer of the Ritz Hotel, who had apparently considerable experience of driving celebrities and indeed members of various royal families around Paris. But whether he was equipped to get away from a group of pursuing motorcyclists on a dipping, bending road at night at between 140 and 160 kilometers an hour, that we will never know. The fact is, the car spun out of his control and crashed.
And Bill, any idea what's happened to the car? Now, we saw it being taken away, the wreckage of it being taken away. Presumably now detailed forensic examination will take place to find out exactly what happened.
Yes, it is at a police depot somewhere in Paris. The police, for good reason, are not telling us where. And they are going over that car with a fine-tooth comb, and they are going back to the scene again to try once again to find out the sequence. Did the motorcycles in some way block the car? Was there another vehicle involved? The police at the minute seem to be ruling that out. But did the motorcycles in any way contribute to this accident? And of course the police are at the moment considering charges of manslaughter against the people, the photojournalists who they have detained. I spoke just a few minutes ago to Arthur Edwards, a British journalist who has followed the royal family for many years. He says it's his information that none of those who've been detained, none of those who were on the motorcycles and scooters are British, but we do not know their nationalities. And of course, it's not necessarily British photographers and journalists who follow Diana all the time or who follow members of the royal family. Indeed, many of the more lurid, sensational, and indeed lucrative shots have been taken with long lenses from freelance photographers who are not members of the British press pack, but who know that one photograph can buy them 1 year of travelling around Europe, probably, following members of the royal family. So we don't yet know the identities or the nationalities of those photographers. They certainly have been questioned by police. We don't yet know if the police have released them from custody.
Bill Neely in Paris for the time being. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's go now to Buckingham Palace, where Tim Hewitt, our reporter, is there. Tim, the crowd's gathering behind you, I see.
Yes, indeed, Dermot. The crowd is now, as you can probably see, although the police have cleared an area across the front of Buckingham Palace, there is a crowd now here of many, many hundred people. They've been gathering since first light, really. People have been laying floral tributes to the princess at the front gates of Buckingham Palace, and about 30 minutes ago the police tried to move those flowers aside so the gates could be used, and there was a fairly angry response from a small section of the crowd, and it was decided to leave the flowers where they are. But people have been laying flowers all morning. There's a mixture here of tourists and British people, a lot of tourists obviously at this time of the year, but the news has spread very fast and people have come to express their grief.
What have people been saying to you, Tim?
Well, the first people to arrive were mostly younger people, not surprisingly. This was at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. A lot of people perhaps going home from parties or perhaps going to early morning jobs. We spoke to a group of students who'd come straight here after a night out, each carrying a single rose. Their feeling was very much that the princess represented the young people of this country. She was the one member of the family who they felt in touch with, and they simply wanted to express their grief. Since then, all manner of people have been coming here. A lot of the people who have arrived, I think it's fair to say, may not have heard the news at all. We saw a busload of Japanese tourists turn up, take photographs of themselves and just come to see the sights, and were rather bewildered and surprised to find out what had been going on. But mainly it's an outpouring of grief, as you'd expect, and from young people particularly, a very strong feeling that they've lost somebody that they felt very close to.
Tim, there are the formal questions about the period of mourning, the removal of the princess's body from Paris. Is anything coming out of Buckingham Palace about that?
Nothing has come out so far. My understanding is that the Lord Chamberlain and his office or his staff are meeting at the moment, as we understand it, to discuss questions of funeral arrangements. There are various formalities to be dealt with, I believe, about returning the princess's body to this country from France. I think as the day goes on, we'll get more information about that. We're still waiting to find out when the Queen and other members of the royal household are due back here. We are expecting them back today, but at the moment, there's been no formal word, at this end anyway, about that.
OK, Tim, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's now go to Balmoral, where the royal family have been on holiday. Prince Charles, the young Princes William and Harry. Our reporter David Rose is there. David, what's the mood there?
A very, very sombre mood. The media's been here since about 5 in the morning, and they're a lot more subdued, understandably, than usual. Tourists, local people, visitors have been coming, standing quietly. What we're really all waiting for now is the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, who we believe, we haven't been told officially, are going to be driving out of Balmoral Castle there. Balmoral's just across the River Dee there, down to the main road here, and up the 200 yards to the little church on the hill, Crathy Church. In other words, the Queen and the Duke are going to be following their normal Sunday morning routine when they're on holiday in the Highlands. They're going to go to the 11:30 service. We also gather that it is unlikely that Prince Charles and Prince Harry, Prince William are going to go. I would think they're in a private room together as far as possible from prying eyes and prying lenses.
David Rose in Balmoral, thank you very much indeed. Well, Nicholas Owen, our royal correspondent, has been with me in the studio all morning. That church service that David Rose describes will be an enormously sombre affair.
It will indeed, yes. You know, I think we are hoping to hear a little later in the programme the church service. There's going to be prayers across the country this morning for Diana, Princess of Wales, who, as we've been saying, died after this terrible road accident in Paris in the early hours. Yeah, it's going to be fairly desperate feelings there, of course, as everywhere else. We did hear a report earlier, I think we mentioned it, that it is suggested that the Prince of Wales will in fact go to Paris himself at some stage. We obviously await confirmation. There's an awful lot of toing and froing going on, arrangements being made in the usual way. And also this business of, you know, who should do what where. Let's remember that Diana, Princess of Wales, was not actually or legally a member of the royal family. Following her divorce, she ceased to be that. However, the Queen made it clear in official public proclamation that she was to be regarded as a member of the royal family and accorded the respect and, to some extent, the privileges of that, of course. But there are, you know, questions of protocol that arise, and sadly, some of those will have to be taken into consideration as well.
We were talking earlier about the issue of privacy and that photo call that Prince Charles had with the young prince's kind of quid pro quo deal. I'll give you these photographs of me and the boys by the river in Balmoral and then leave me alone for the rest of the week. He was able to do that kind of thing, protected as he was on the royal estates.
Yes,
the princess,
well, that's
of course,
true.
was out in the wide
Well,
world.
she was. And the other thing to say about it is, to be absolutely blunt about it, the real interest among paparazzi was not the Prince of Wales or his sons. It was always in Diana, so he was on pretty safe ground. In fact, there were 2 invitations to the press. That's what really very surprised everybody. There were 2 opportunities. There was on, I think it was on a Tuesday and then again on the following Saturday, just to make the point that if people left them alone. But Diana, of course, never really been in that happy situation. She, you know, she's been popping up here and there. And one point I would make, though, is this. Her relationship with Dodi Fayed obviously brought her great happiness in the last few weeks of her life, and I think that's how a lot of people will remember that particular relationship. And there were times during it when she was quite clearly quite happy to be photographed. She was saying to the world, you know, this is the man. I don't know whether it was love or not. Probably they were still at the stage of finding out, but that she didn't mind at all if those pictures appeared, to tell the world that yes, she was very much in love. But of course, I think it was Mike Lloyd earlier who said you can't just turn this sort of thing on and off. You know, when the photographers were there the next morning and she didn't want to be photographed, then it was a different matter. So there was always a balance, always a lot of tension in this matter.
Well, Nick, I never had the privilege to be in her company. You obviously did. What was it like when she stepped into a room?
Well, I have to tell you that the first time I met her, she was already in the room. And I came into it, I was a little late, as usual, some might say. Anyway, I came into the room, and there she was, just sort of leaning against the table, talking to other people who were in the room. And we were due to have a small lunch party, and I just thought to myself, my goodness me, this is this lady who I've reported on and everything else, but here she was in front of me. But she immediately had this way of putting you at your ease. I mean, I know people say that all the time about the Queen and the Queen Mother and everything else, but Diana really did have that capacity. After all, let's remember, she was 36 years old. Many men found her a very, very attractive woman, and she did have all the charisma and personality that went with all of that, but it was amazing. I mean, that was the first thing. And then the way she would engage you in conversation, it was quite extraordinary. But let's go back to her children. The children, I want to just want to talk about that.
Just coming in from Buckingham Palace of children laying flowers. She had a special place in her heart for all children all around the world.
Ah, there they are. Ah, look at that. A prayer being said. Another child. Look at all those flowers there. Look. Some suggestion earlier that the police had tried to clear them away, and the crowd said no, leave the flowers. And there will be many, many more of them in the next few days.